Yeah, we've had 72 folks that have stayed here so far for various lengths of time. We have 34 people here now. I think we've had 23 folks transition out to a better situation, moving in with family or friends or their own apartment. And then we've had, I think, 12 people that have been evicted for rules violations. So I think both of those kind of show the emergence of a self-governed community. It shows that we are enforcing our rules. We are asking folks that don't follow those very basic rules to leave. And the success stories show that, putting people in a similar situation and allowing them to support each other and improve their situation is also working as well. Community agreement that everyone must sign, and when there's an infraction on that community agreement, there's a village council that basically delegates disciplinary action for breaking that community agreement, which can range from a written warning to 48 hours out to an eviction. And ultimately, the village council's decision can be appealed to the village meeting in general, so it really creates that horizontal organization. And at first that's something we added in the middle because the village council was kind of being demonized, like, oh, they have all this authority. And we basically said, well, if you don't like the council's decision, you can appeal it to the village as a whole. And so basically every decision that's made here can be brought to the village meeting, and so ultimately everybody has an equal voice. And if a majority of folks feel one way, then that's the direction that the village goes. And like I said, ultimately, critical decisions come to the board. We have bi-monthly board meetings, so those come to our meeting and we review them and just make sure that everything is in line with our agreement with the city. Yeah, I think there's definitely a perception by some that there's not a strong sense of community here, but I think it's just it's not your picturesque vision of what community looks like. It's not all like kumbaya, love your neighbor sort of thing, but there's very, people support each other here, and you can, I see it every time I'm here, and it just kind of looks a little different than you would suspect community to look. It's a little messy sometimes and there's conflict, but ultimately, I think they're doing a great job and working together to make this place better. You can see it every time you come back here. The place looks a little bit nicer, and there's a new add-on to the kitchen or a new couch in the yard or something, and so people are just kind of making it their own, and I think it's been going for the better. And I think the piece that people don't get, when you say self-governance or self-management, and then also combine, with normal people, like a lot of times they think, well, that doesn't sound very practical, and then when you add the word homeless, they're like, oh, well, that can't work, can it? And I think the piece that people miss, is that each individual has a common interest in seeing this place succeed, and that's what makes this place run. Is because while folks aren't financially invested in this place, they're maybe even more importantly personally invested, because people know that if we slip up and don't follow through with our agreement with the city, that this place could be shut down at any given moment. And so I can see it's hard for folks to vote someone out. It becomes about the greater good of the village as a whole, and if somebody is kind of bringing that down, they have to make the decision to maybe vote that person out and move on. Yeah. Well, I think a really neat piece about this project is that it kind of grew rather organically, where folks moved in from the beginning. We built a few houses, and some of the folks moved into houses, and some folks were living in tents while their houses got built. And we've basically developed this place as people have lived here. So at first we just had porta potties and people were having to do laundry off-site. Since then we've added the bathhouse, which is one structure which includes 2 bathrooms, a shower, and a laundry. So I think that 112 square foot facility in and of itself really dramatically improved the quality of life here. We also were first holding our meetings under, a little tarp tent basically, and since then we've gotten the 30-foot yurt, which is heated and has Wi-Fi, so it's kind of a nice place for people to hang out. And then we also have the kitchen, which is recently now stocked by Food for Lane County, so there's always a lot of great food in there that can be shared by the community. So I think that's kind of the really neat thing about the village piece, is that we're taking people off the streets and giving them a more stable place to reside, but we're also connecting that with these amenities that kind of improve the quality of life for everyone. And I say for everyone, you know, not just for the residents, but also, you know, for folks in the surrounding community, because we all know that leaving folks unhoused has quite a toll on the surrounding community and city services as well, so that when we can create places like this that are kind of self-contained and provide basically most of the things people need on site, you know, I think that can definitely reduce negative impacts on the rest of the city associated with homelessness. Structures here aren't hooked up to utilities. Obviously this isn't an end goal, but you know, I think the difference between the street and a place like Opportunity Village is a far greater gap than, you know, from Opportunity Village to maybe like a conventional apartment, because, you know, we can talk about, a lot of times people don't, you know, it's housing, a lot of times we talk about structures and amenities, but, you know, the most basic principles of home actually have very little to do with structure. You know, it's privacy, security, the ability to stay warm and dry. And beyond that, everything else becomes a little bit more convenient, you know. So we're really trying to cover a lot of the basics here in making the step from the street to Opportunity Village. I think another thing that's really come out of this project, you know, so it's only a 30-unit project. Obviously, that doesn't address the scale of a homelessness or housing affordability, but I think one of the most useful things that we have done is kind of refocus the conversation around homelessness. We've seen 2 other nonprofits that have taken form since we opened, with Community Supported Shelters and Nightingale, and so it's kind of this new way of thinking about how to address the problem where, you know, municipalities are partnering with local organizations, you know, and working in partnership, and we're finding, you know, that that's actually a very much more effective way of working together rather than, you know, working against each other. Because, you know, before I think this project, a lot of, you know, the conversation around homelessness and affordable housing, you know, like I think like a lot, the average person in this issue is typically only a role of protest. You can, you know, you get a protest like, you know, the city needs to do more of this, or the city shouldn't do that, and this actually provides, you know, a hands-on approach where people can actually get involved and do it themselves. And it took a little while for, you know, like the city or the county to open up to allowing folks to do that, but now that they've done it, I think, you know, they're kind of working incrementally and allowing these types of grassroots projects to take shape. And what they're finding is that, you know, a lot of these fears that were presented about what would happen if you allowed something like this to exist simply aren't coming true. So I think that's probably one of the most, you know, and that's having influences nationally too, because like other places that have been trying to start a project like this for a really long time, you know, can now point to us, and there's a lot of like positive like sound bites that, you know, like the Eugene Police Department has said, you know, this has been open for a year and it hasn't been an impact in terms of crimes, and actually calls in this immediate areas have actually gone down since we've opened. So, you know, the idea that a congregation of a group of homeless folks automatically results in an increase of crime, you know, that's just simply not true, as we're proving with this project. And I think, you know, a lot of where that ideology comes from is like with typical public housing projects where people don't necessarily have a say in where they're living, where they get put into a box, and, you know, that creates kind of like a lot of resentment because they don't really have a voice in shaping that immediate space. What we're doing differently, I think, is involving the people in the process, and that creates a sense of ownership, and I think that's why we're breaking down a lot of these preconceptions about what would happen if you allow homeless people to live together. Just about simplifying your lifestyle and getting rid of a lot of the excess stuff that you don't need. And I think a lot of people that have experienced homelessness really get that, maybe even more so than the average person, but it's basically around this idea of you only need a really small amount of private space to kind of recuperate and rest and regenerate, and then if you support that with an abundance of shared common spaces, that really creates quite a, you know, viable, vibrant community. And I think that's basically what the tiny house village model is. A lot of what we've seen so far with the tiny house, it's about individuals living in tiny houses, singular, you know, maybe in a backyard or something. What I'm really interested in is putting those structures together in a community and connecting them with shared common facilities. About a year doing field research on tent cities that were self-organized by the homeless. I lived in one for a month, and then I visited about a dozen other ones throughout the country. And basically what I found was that there was a lot of positive social dynamics that were going on there. And I described those as self-management, direct democracy, mutual aid, people in a similar situation working together, and then just general resourcefulness, where people were finding creative solutions to living with less. And so rather than the common formal city solution of evicting these people and breaking up these relationships that had been built, I tried to come up with an alternative solution, basically that preserves those positive social dynamics and then improves the physical infrastructure. So taking the tent and then physically building upon that, and so the next logical step from there is the tiny house. And so that's basically kind of the theoretical foundation for Opportunity Village. Yeah, so I mean, the tiny house is a practical solution, not just because it's low cost and that it can be built by volunteers, but also because it's a practical way to kind of downsize our environmental footprint. And it's basically, I think Opportunity Village has provided an example of what little we can live with as humans. And I think we're not quite there with Opportunity Village. Obviously we want to improve the facilities here and build upon that. I think we'll see that with Emerald Village, where we're trying to actually, these will be about 150 to 250 square feet with plumbing and electricity. And so that's, I think, really our end goal, is kind of showing this kind of really, kind of self-sustaining tiny house village model that not just is practical for moving folks out of homelessness, but it also becomes a desirable thing for folks that are either rent stressed or not even necessarily restrained by income. It becomes something that they want to be a part of and something that they want to partake in. We're seeing that really already with we're proposing Emerald Village, and we're quickly finding, like, when we go to these neighborhood meetings where people are like, well, heck, we want to live there too. Like, are you going to make spaces for us? So I mean, I think that's my ultimate goal, is to create communities that are low cost and sustainable and practical for addressing our housing situation, but also kind of reaching that middle ground where it becomes sort of something that middle class folks want to be a part of too. And then you start to blur the line between homeless and the unhoused, and all of a sudden these people are living in similar types of housing communities, and I think that's a pretty interesting concept. We're proposing a site for Emerald Village, and we're talking to the neighborhood about it, and we're talking about, well, there's a lot of rent-stressed folks already in the neighborhood, can we have some of the units for them? And what I'm thinking about right now is, like, well, once we have these low-income homeless folks and these rent-stressed already housed folks living in the same place, like, how are we going to distinguish the difference between them then? It's like the whole place with the houses, the common facilities, and all the utilities cost just under $100,000 to do for a 30-unit development. The individual houses cost about between $1,000 to $2,000 to build, and yeah, it was all done with private donations. I don't think we really received any financial contribution over $5,000. So it was like a lot of small scale, but lots of just donations from around the community, kind of fundraise this whole thing on the power of new and good ideas. And so yeah, and doing that private financing instead of the conventional federal public funding allowed us to kind of try some new ideas, because a lot of times when you take the public funding, it comes with a lot of strings attached and it's hard to do new things. So what we're hoping to do is kind of start some of these models with private funding, show that they can be accessible and sustainable, and maybe hopefully get public funding for these type of projects in the future as demand continues to increase. Yeah, so I mean, I originally, the focus was on tent cities, and you quickly find, the average person's not willing to accept the tent as a viable form of shelter. But I think that's kind of the beauty of the whole tiny house movement, is that it's kind of that next step, but it's also very marketable to the surrounding community because it's something that looks like a house. It's not quite the same as their house, but it resembles their house. And so that aesthetics and charming, curb appeal that comes with these cute little tiny houses is, I think, a pretty imperative piece to getting these types of projects accepted by the local community.